So this webinar is titled Psalms of War, When to Pray and When Not to Pray. Praying for personal enemies versus praying against wickedness in civil authorities. Well, we've just prayed Psalm 35 together, and it's invigorating to pray that way, but is it really biblical? I decided to do a quick look on a description of the imprecatory Psalms, as they're called, to see what Wikipedia had to say, which is not always a reliable source, but I was interested. It says imprecatory psalms are praying against one's enemies. It even says pulling down curses. It also says in this article that the New Testament forbids disciples from invoking the wrath of God upon others. Well, at face value, this does seem to be true. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said this, "But I tell you, love your enemies and bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you and pray for those who mistreat you and persecute you." Matthew 5:44. But there's a difference between a personal enemy and a coercive civil enemy, or government being used for wicked purposes. So when is it appropriate to pray a psalm of war? Well, here's my suggestion as you look at this. When to pray. You can pray a psalm of war against the wicked when a person is using coercive power to come against you to forbid what God commands or command what God forbids. Well, what is coercive power? Coercive power means the ability to force you and harm you physically, economically, and relationally. When would you not pray a psalm of war? Well, you might not pray a psalm of war when a person who has coercive power to come against you may be hassling you but does not violate God's commands. You would not pray a psalm of war when a person has no coercive power to come against you. You need to turn the other cheek, pray for, and love them, just as Jesus commanded. But when civil government, church government, corporations, colleges, any institutional power that can harm you comes against you in a wicked fashion, forbidding what God commands and commanding what God forbids, the psalms of war are a way to pray against this spiritual wickedness. So again, Jesus' command to turn the other cheek. Love your enemies and pray for them. Turn the other cheek. Carry the burden a second mile. All these commands are for a personal level, not an institutional level. When not to turn the other cheek? That is when God has given civil government coercive power, that is the power of force, the power of the sword, ultimately the power to take life. We are to pray and act differently and in a different way depending on whether it's a personal enemy versus an institutional enemy. And when an institution is being repurposed not for God, but against God and his people, we are allowed to pray the psalms of war. Jesus had harsh words for wicked leaders, and we're deceived if we think that Jesus was all meek and mild. We have created a just get along and anything goes Jesus, and we ignore his bold judgment of wicked leaders. Some of the things that he had to say about wicked leaders in his time, as he called them blind guides, blind fools, full of greed and wickedness, serpents, brood of vipers, hypocrites, whitewashed tombs. You are of your father, the devil, and you hypocrites, you sons of hell. Jesus is not all meek and mild. Jesus is also bold as a lion, and this needs to be held in dynamic tension. So when's it appropriate to pray a psalm of war? When a person using coercive power to come against you to forbid what God commands and command what God forbids. And that's what Doug Giles' book, Psalms of War, addresses. So with discernment, we need to know when to pray and when not to pray. Praying for personal enemies versus praying against wickedness in civil authorities. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for considering these things, and thanks for listening.